The British Museum's South Asia section has some of the most fascinating pieces from the region. Recently, it got an overhaul, and Dr. Sushma Jansari, the curator, takes us through some of its treasures.
Hello, my name is Dr. Sushma Jansari. I'm the Tabor Foundation Curator of South Asia at the British Museum, and I look after the ancient and medieval collections and also the ethnographic material, including textiles and even Siberia. Today, I'm going to take you on a short tour through the Gandhara displays at the British Museum and look at some of our incredible treasures on display. So today I'm going to talk through curating a display. We often hear really fascinating stories about particular objects, but what I thought I would share is during the project to refurbish the whole of the Sir Joseph Houghton Gallery for China and South Asia, we got the opportunity to really relook at all of our collections and the kind of stories we can tell with that material. So the previous iteration of this gallery was quite art historical. It was done in the 90s, which is a very different period of time. And most of the stories on display were religious stories, and mostly the indigenous religions of South Asia. So there was a lot on Hinduism and Hindu art, Jainism, Buddhism. And we thought we wanted to do something new for our new audience. And so I'm just going to talk you through how we approach this new gallery and the kinds of stories that we have told. But my overall focus is going to be on Gandhara, because I certainly can't take you through the whole gallery, it's quite big. And I thought that would be a lovely case study to look at new display strategies. There are so many challenges, but also so many opportunities. I think one of the great things is that the collection is so wide-ranging, and we were able to curate this gallery starting from 1.5 million years ago with the Paleolithic, so Paleolithic hand axes, and then we brought the story all the way through to the modern day. So we ended with two very generous donations. One was Pandit Ravi Shankar Sitar, which his family donated to us, which is really quite incredible. And more recently, Ustad Alaraka's daughter has donated his tabla, the tabla that he used for his European concerts. So we've been able to tell such a rich story, but the challenges are significant because they are enormous collections and no one can be an expert in everything. So it's when you first start looking at this material, you do feel very apprehensive, because you think, I can't know all of this, I don't know all of this, but gradually you learn. And I think it's really important to mention that, you know, my predecessors have long been very generous with their knowledge, and it takes many years to get to know this material. But it's incredible. It's a real privilege to work with it. I always absolutely love welcoming people into the gallery, and I really like sharing the story of how we came up with this particular new display of the gallery. And so when you first enter the gallery, on the right hand side you have the China gallery, and on the left hand side you have the South Asia gallery. And the first thing you notice is that you have these incredible columns running the full length of the gallery, and they are a beautiful rich turquoisey blue colour. And what we're trying to do is really highlight to our visitors that this is South Asia, and it has a beautiful Shiva Nataraja, a Chola bronze right in the middle to welcome you to this section of the gallery. And one of the things you'll notice if you came to the gallery in the 1990s compared with now is that previously the whole length of the gallery was packed full of really extraordinary sculptures. And one thing we really wanted to do was to have a space that we could use not only as this incredible gallery, but also to hold events. And so we moved a lot of these sculptures to these bays on either side. So when I talk about bay, this is an Edwardian gallery, and we were not allowed to change any of the display cases because they are historic, early 20th century display cases. So we were quite restricted in what we could and couldn't do in the gallery. But what we could do is make these huge white plinths and place objects on them at the entrance to each of these bays, but also inside each of these bays, place some of the objects there as well. And that meant that we had this full run of this really long, amazing gallery for loads of events. And just for example, we had a partnership with Academy, which is a cultural institute here in the UK. It's based in London, and they create and curate the most incredible dances. They have so many amazing dancers who work with them. And some of the dancers came to the gallery and looked at the different kinds of sculptures on display and thought about how they could respond through dance. And they did. And it was such a moving moment to have them in the gallery and share their beautiful art form and the artworks with members of the general public. And the video is it's on YouTube, so anyone can watch it. But it explains why we have the sculptures at the entrance of these bays. And the one I'm going to talk about is of the seated Buddha, and it's a beautiful Gandhara sculpture. It's carved from a lovely, slightly sparkly grey schist, and if you look at him, he's sitting in Dharma Chakra mudra. That's his hands. So it's like about to turn the wheel of Dharma here, and he's a really beautiful, welcoming presence into the bay that looks at Gandhara in the museum. And when you enter this bay, right at the end, you see a huge window. So we have absolutely enormous windows that run the full length of this gallery, and they let in light, so light floods in. And this is really important when you're curating a gallery and you have really precious ancient and contemporary objects. You don't want them to be damaged, and light can be very damaging. So one of the reasons we started with the ancient to medieval section on the right-hand side of the gallery, the north side, which is where the light comes flooding in, is because this kind of stone and metal material, it's fine. It can quite happily sit in slightly shaded light, whereas with the more contemporary material, with the, for example, say contemporary, but I mean things like medieval Mughal paintings, textiles, things like that, we've put that on the south side of the gallery, where we've blocked off a lot more light, so you can have much more carefully managed light levels, which once again is really important because you don't want to damage your collections which are on display. And so, we have regular rotations every 6 months or so. The paintings are rotated and new ones are brought in for the gallery. So that's a really important part of what we all do. So when you first enter this bay, you have a large panel on your right-hand side, and this basically shares the overall story that you're going to be experiencing in each one of these sections. Now, the one from Gandhara, for example, there is always a map. And just to let you know, we had some really useful evaluations made of our visitors and the gallery, just to find out a little more about how much do they know about the history of South Asia and maybe the religions of South Asia, what about the material culture? And we found that actually the vast majority of our visitors who are from abroad, about 75% or so are from abroad, they don't really know a great deal about the history, the culture, the religions of the subcontinent. And so it's really important that we share snippets of information so that whatever section they stop in, they learn something, they can take something away from them. So in the entrance of the bay, you have this panel text, and right at the very top, you will see a little bit of text in one of the scripts of South Asia, although Gandhara, I have to say, is a little different. So I read through so many different texts, and I ended up with a Chinese text. So I ended up with Faxian's beautiful description of Gandhara. And I'll read it out to you because I think for me, it really evokes it brings to life, I think, this display. And he wrote, kings, ministers, and the people vie with one another to make offerings at the stupas. Flowers are scattered and lamps are lit without end. And this was, he was traveling to India as a pilgrim in around AD 400. So this is really early. But I think what it does is it brings to life these sculptures. It reminds us that people would venerate and walk around this material, they would donate it, they would interact with it. All of this material had a life long before it arrived in any museum. And there are Gandhara collections at museums across South Asia, East Asia, North America, Europe, and here at the museum as well. And the other bit of information that this text gives, and bearing in mind we were limited to 120 words, and the top paragraph will basically tell you a little bit about Gandhara. Now, most of our visitors, they don't know a great deal about Gandhara. They may not even have heard the word. So I just introduced the region to them. So it introduces Gandhara as this ancient province centered on the Peshawar Valley in modern-day Pakistan. And there's also Greater Gandhara, which extends into what is modern-day Afghanistan. But bit which is also relevant here is that Gandhara also refers to a school of Buddhist art, and that is mostly what is on display here. And we also explained that Buddhism arrived in this area because some people might be surprised to find incredible Buddhist ruins in modern-day Pakistan and Afghanistan, but of course there was a long history of incredible Buddhist stupas and monasteries and pilgrims and artwork in this region. And in fact it arrived in around the mid-3rd century BC, and it flourished especially during the early centuries AD, and that is when most of our collections date from. I think I'm going to explain to you a little bit about gateway objects. So whenever you go to a museum, you see a display and you assume, oh, it's just a case, curators have just put a few objects in and hope for the best. Well, I have to say we put so much thought and effort into every single one of our displays. And one thing we found is that people don't just come into a gallery, they don't follow the route that you hope that they would follow. They don't follow, the whole the timeline from ancient all the way through to present. They walk through and they bounce from display to display. They'll move to things that they think, oh, that's interesting, and they'll wander over, and there's something else will catch their attention, they'll wander over to that. And you don't have very long to really grab their attention and share a story with them. And one thing we found really successful is the idea of gateway objects. So as I mentioned, we've got these historic Edwardian cases, display cases that we can't really change very much. And they're in 3 parts. So you've got 3 large rectangular windows through which you can see incredible objects. Now, we found that people tend to go straight towards the middle one. And so that's our gateway into the rest of the case. So if you go to the gateway section that I'm going to share with you right now, it's a really rich story about Vajrapani, and Vajrapani is the embodiment of the Buddha's power. And one of the things that people might be really surprised to know is that many of his attributes, even the way he stands, they're drawn from the Greek god Heracles. And in this one gateway display, I've placed a 2nd century BC small bronze figure of Heracles, and that was found in Afghanistan. And right next to it, there's a stunning panel, a carved stone schist panel. And there you have Vajrapani standing. And having those side by side, you can see that Vajrapani, he's got the contrapposto posture, so he's leaning back on one leg. He's got Heracles' lion skin headdress, and in one of his hands, his right hand, he's holding the Vajra, the thunderbolt. And that's an attribute from Indra, from Zeus. And then in his left hand, he's leaning, as Heracles would lean, on Vajrapani's leaning on a sword, but Heracles would be leaning on his club. So there are so many moments of religious syncretism up in Gandhara during this period. And I think it's such a surprising story that I think people hopefully people, hopefully it captures people's attention so that they look at it and they think, oh my goodness, I hadn't realized that this was the case. I didn't know that there was sharing between religions in this period of time in this particular region, whereas of course there was. So it's a really great opportunity to teach, to share, to challenge people's preconceptions as well. And the nice thing is that when you look at this little bit of text, and I have to say that the vast majority of visitors, between 50 and 20% of all visitors to a gallery are likely to read a label. And I certainly don't mean all labels, I mean one or two labels. Most visitors do not read text in galleries. So often you'll hear people saying, oh no, you need to tell a richer story, write more. But actually that doesn't do much good at all, because people simply don't read the text. And I have to say, I'm sort of guilty of this as well. When I go into a gallery, I'll be honest, I don't often read very much text. I tend to look at the objects, wander around, and then head back to the gift shop or maybe the cafe. So I understand the visitors as well. But here we have just a short bit of text, 120 words, just like the panel text. So it's consistent. People know what they're getting. You'll get in the top paragraph of around 60 words, you get the broad idea of what this case is about. And the second section, the second paragraph, is basically just telling that story about Vajrapani and Heracles, which I just shared here. And then when you enter the rest of the bay, I was thinking more about the visitors, and I think it's really important to say that when you're curating a display, you're not curating it for yourself, even though that's extremely tempting. You're displaying objects for visitors, and as I mentioned, many of them don't know a great deal about Gandhara. And so I started from the very beginning. I thought, we have this incredible sculptural material, but where is it from? Generally, it tends to be displayed in quite an art historical way and independently as pieces of artworks in and of themselves, which is great, and I think that can look so beautiful. But I thought I want to do something slightly different. I wanted to share with our visitors that all of this material originated on a stupa. And in order to do that, you have to explain what is a stupa. You really got to go back to basics. And so one of my previous colleagues, Elizabeth Errington, drew a stunning picture of a very traditional Gandhara stupa. And so there's an image of that at the very back of the case, and you can see the Jatravali, you see all the different components, the drum, the steps. And so all of a sudden, the visitor recognizes that all of these little components that are on display, like right in the middle, in the gateway section, there are a whole load of stair risers. Oh yes, they must fit onto this particular structure. And then you look left and there's a huge Jatravali with a beautiful carving of a lotus on the underneath that you would, if you looked up, that's what you would see. And then you have an Indo-Corinthian capital. And once again, just like the Heracles and Vajrapani story, this is really unexpected, I think, for most people, because here with the Indo-Corinthian style, you've got this decorative column, and it's a fusion of Indian and classical Greek architecture. And when you look closely, you bend down, you have a look, you see the Buddha seated under a canopy of acanthus leaves, and it tells his moment of enlightenment. And this is a real innovation of the Gandharan style of Buddhist art. And then you might look round and you look to the top right, and there's a whole series of stucco heads, and they are so individual, they are so compelling, and thousands of these have been found in Gandhara. Generally speaking, the bodies have not survived because they tended to be made from clay, coated in a thin layer of stucco, and were painted. So it's very fragile, it's not likely to survive, and most of them haven't. And these heads and these figures would decorate stupas, whereas others were sort of venerated in shrines that were built around the stupas. And these were faster, easier, and way cheaper to produce than stone sculpture. And in the later Gandharas, so like 5th, 6th centuries, there were loads of stucco heads and stucco sculpture that is created. And one of my favourite objects in this particular display is actually a garland holder. And if you remember that beautiful quotation from Fasien, he talked about, the garlands of flowers and the divas that were lit. And so this is actually one of the garland holders. So garland holders are among the earliest pieces of sculpture decoration from Gandharan stupas, and many were donated by devotees. So there's a really personal connection here. And these were fixed to the stupa drum, the big central drum of a stupa, and they were used to support decorative flower garlands. And so when you look closely at this figure, you have this male figure, and he's rising once again out of acanthus leaves. So it's a very compelling and unusual kind of style that maybe our visitors are not used to seeing, although they may well have seen acanthus leaves in the Greek or Roman galleries. And so it's bringing a little bit of that here. And as you move around the display a little more, I was thinking how many people know the story of the Buddha's life. Most of us have probably heard of the Buddha, but you can't really understand and decode or read Buddhist art without having a really basic concept of the key moments in his life that tend to be represented in Buddhist art. And I thought, given the collection that we have some really spectacular sculpture from Gandhara stupas, and I thought, you know what, let's put on display those really key moments in his life that are most commonly found in Buddhist art. So you start at the top with Prince Siddhartha's conception and his birth, then you have his renunciation and departure, the moment he reaches enlightenment, his parinirvana, and at the bottom, his relics. And that'll be important for the bit I'm going to talk about next. But I really wanted people to look closely, or at least glance at these different incredible scenes, so that when they do see other Buddhist sculptures or paintings, they'll recognize these particular scenes, because they're often so similar that if you can read one, so for example, Queen Maya's conception of the Buddha and when she gave birth, when you recognize that, whenever you see it somewhere, you will immediately know what you're looking at. And I think this is a really important part of understanding religious art, because otherwise that deeper meaning is really lost in favor of quite a generic impression of something quite pretty or quite interesting or something just to walk past. But I think you find when you start understanding what you're looking at and why something was created, you're more likely to engage with it and to look at it and to understand it. And for me, I think that's really valuable. It's a really valuable part of visiting a museum and understanding what you're looking at. So at this point, you've already learned a few really key things, whether you've actively thought about it or not, if you've glanced at something or looked more deeply. You've already learned, where is Gandhara? What is a stupa? What are all these pieces of stone that make up a stupa? And also that the Buddha's life is an integral part of the sculptural decoration of a stupa. And if you started off by knowing not very much at all about this region or its art, that's a huge amount of knowledge. Even if it's quite superficial, it's something you can build on as you visit other museums and other displays. And the next thing you come to is, God, this is such an incredible object. Sometimes you have to pinch yourself when you actually see it or even handle it. So the Buddha didn't always look as he does now, the way we recognize him, either seated or standing, draped in robes. At first, he was shown in symbolic form, so he would have been shown through footprints, an empty throne, a sacred parasol, and it wasn't until a little later that he was shown in human or bodily form. And this object is the Bimran casket. It's small, it's gold, and it is so incredibly beautifully made, and it's so intricate and so detailed, and also it has an incredible story. So this casket dates to around 75 AD, certainly the later 1st century AD, and this is the earliest datable representation of the Buddha in human form. It's easily, to my mind, one of the most important objects in the whole of the museum, and it tells such a rich and compelling story. So we might assume that it was certainly a Buddhist who would have donated this object and interred it in a stupa. But actually, when you look at the casket, the stone casket that it was found in, it's actually the inscription on the lid tells us that it was a person called Shiva Rakshita. So somebody with a Shaivite name was donating this object. And then when you look at the Buddha, he's flanked by two figures, and they're not Buddhist bodhisattvas, which you might assume, but actually one is Indra and the other is Brahma. So once again, you're telling this much richer story of a multi-religious region and part of the world, even on the most sacred objects. And this one is extraordinary. And I have to say the display for this was quite tricky because it's such an iconic object, you don't want to get it wrong. And I thought, well, how are we going to do this? And one of the great things was working with one of my colleagues in the scientific research department and the conservators as well. And so wonderful conservator Rachel actually put back one of the inlays which had fallen out, goodness, almost 2,000 years ago when it was still interred in the stupa. And when you go and see the display now, there is this small little turquoise cross just by the Buddha's feet. And also you see the row of garnets at the top and the bottom. And alongside all of this, I decided to put all of the material that came with this particular deposit, because I think it's important not to separate the idea of a beautiful relic casket and the deposit that came with it. And so you'll see tiny little trays of beads, and some of them are stone. You've got like an aquamarine one. They're all very different. And then also a whole row of 4 coins, and these coins were vital because they helped to date this particular object. And actually, when you look at the very back of it, and it's a small object, and it would easily fit onto the palm of your hand. And I thought, if you want to really understand what's on, what kind of imagery is on this particular reliquary, you need some kind of drawing to show people. And so a colleague actually drew out and sort of unfolded this particular reliquary in a drawing, so it runs the full width of the case, so that actually you can understand, and you can see it see it bigger than it is on the reliquary. And for me, that's really important, actually. My dad was partially sighted, so going into a museum and looking at small things, it was tricky. You couldn't see it so well. And one of the things I worked with a colleague on is having audio described tours. So sometimes we go into the gallery, or we've also done it actually through YouTube video as well, so that you get a tour of the gallery with really rich descriptions, and you can experience the objects in a very different way if you are either completely blind or have another visual impairment. And another thing we have done so far just once, but we're hoping to do it again, is a touch tour. So you have these rich descriptions, and there are a couple of objects which are quite robust. And so a couple of people, they can touch them as to experience them as we're going through the gallery. But what I thought was really interesting is that most people, they hesitated about touching any of these objects. They preferred to simply listen. So, still learning, so much to do. But I thought for me, that was a really interesting part of that experience. And alongside the Boomerang casket, so if you're standing in front of it and you look to your left, there is a whole series of other reliquaries. And I put on display pretty much the whole collection of reliquaries from Gandhara that we have, along with any deposits that we have as well, so that people get a really good idea that there is not simply one type of reliquary. They come in all different shapes and sizes and materials, mostly stone or metal, I have to say, and sometimes combined in one deposit. So you might have a stone casket with small, tiny little silver or gold containers enclosed inside it as well. And also through these deposits and through these particular objects, you can see some really international links that Gandhara had. It wasn't a region that was somehow secluded or isolated. It was very much part of the wider world, whether the Silk Roads or trading routes down into India, or even Indo-Roman trade. And it's that particular thing that I want to mention, because one of these beautiful reliquaries was actually repurposed. It was originally an amulet, a stunning gold amulet, and inside it there were found some coins. Some of them were Kushan coins, but others were coins of some Roman emperors that were found alongside it. So it's testament to this region's reach and the way it absorbed and integrated different kinds of material culture in even sometimes the most sacred deposits and moments as well. And one thing I do have to mention, because I think if you're a visitor, you might not notice this, but there are many nerdy moments in this gallery, and this is one of them. So as I mentioned, it's an amulet reliquary, a stunning gold one. And I placed a rather gorgeous stone sculpture of Maitreya, and he's wearing some of these beautiful amulet reliquaries just in front of the window. So you just need to turn right and you'll see that, and you'll see how it was worn, and just like this one that was converted into a reliquary. I currently have 2 PhD students who are looking into 2 aspects of collecting history and the South Asia collections. So one, Kajal Magani, for example, is researching the South Asian collectors represented at the British Museum. And my other PhD student, Niti Acharya, is looking at women collectors represented in the South Asia collections. And I think this kind of research is vital. I mean, I myself have also done quite a bit of research into the collecting history of these incredible collections, particularly in Sri Lanka. And I think it's important that we surface a lot of these stories and share them as widely as we can. We also do gallery tours, which are free and at lunchtimes to the general public, so anyone who wants to come along. And also there are these kinds of talks, which I think are very important, but also it's important to have those on display. And just one example is Bhagwanlal Indraji, who bequeathed the Mathura lion capital, which is made in about the 1st century AD. And we've put that story on the British Museum's website, and it's also on display in the gallery itself. So I think it's really important to research and share this knowledge as widely as possible. There are so many extraordinary objects. Perhaps unexpectedly, my absolute favourite object is really quite small. It's only maybe 3-4 inches high, and it's a very small bronze figure of the goddess Tara, the Buddhist goddess Tara, and she's just seated and she looks so serene. And when I go into the gallery, I often just walk through the gallery to that particular display and just have a few moments of just calm, relaxing. You can center yourself a little bit, and then I carry on with my day. But it's that object. It's not one of the big, incredible stone sculptures or some blingy gold object or something. It's just that one small bronze figure. I love gift shops. Whenever I go to a museum, I tend to make a beeline for the gift shop before I go to any galleries. So yeah, I have to say the gift shop. And also I get a nice discount, so that's always helpful too. One of the things I've been working on for the last couple of years is a book, and I'm very excited to say it's going to be published in June 2023, and its title is Chandragupta Maurya, The Creation of a National Hero in India, and I can't wait for it to come out, and I'd love to hear what people think of it. It's been so lovely taking you through the gallery in this way and actually sharing some of the stories behind the displays, how we approached combining objects and pulling together the displays, how we pull together all the text that goes with it, and also maybe a clearer idea of how much we think about our visitors when doing it. It's really not about us, and I think as a curator that's something I learned very early on. If a display is successful, it's one that works for the museum's visitors, and I've learned so much about the people who visit our galleries, and I often pop downstairs sometimes as well, just to see how people are interacting with the displays. Is there something I need to tweak or change? And so I really hope you've enjoyed this walk through the Gandhara section of the gallery, and I really hope you come and visit us soon. That'd be wonderful.